So let's get started, and we're going to talk about the Gospel of Matthew today. I know that we finished with Mark and going through kind of our verse by verse, chapter by chapter breakdown. And now we're going to spend some time going through Matthew and looking at some of the same sort of questions that we did before that we would largely categorize as backgrounds. So the general questions of who wrote the text, when did they write it, under what circumstances or why, and kind of also tracing the big takeaways, the big themes or the big ideas that are coming out in the Gospel of Matthew. So the obvious first question is, who wrote it? And most of us would say, well, obviously it's Matthew. It's right there in the name, Gospel of Matthew. As with all the other Gospels, the thing that we've talked about frequently is they are, by nature, anonymous. The Gospels are written without identifying who the author is. Now, we have two different methods that we use to try to identify who the author is. We can look at church history and see who it is that the church ascribes the text to, which for us, for this text, is Matthew, right? It's the same thing that we talked about with Mark, where you've got Eusebius writing about what Papias says, and Papias describes Matthew and says Matthew wrote the gospel first in the Hebrew language, whatever that means. And for a lot of church history, that has been accepted. The other method, which modern scholars try to use, is to say, yeah, we can't really give a lot of we can't give a lot of points to Eusebius and Papias. We don't know how trustworthy that is. We don't know if that's just they hope it's written by this guy. So we need to look into the text to see what the text tells us about the author, or if the author identifies himself in some way in the text. I would point out, yes, the text is anonymous, but the text is not received anonymously. And by that I mean, yes, Paul, when he writes a letter, he signs his name at the end of it. It's not anonymous. He says he's writing it. He starts off that way. When Jude writes Jude, the first word in the book is Jude, right? He identifies himself. And the Gospels don't do that. Okay. But if you write an anonymous gospel and send it to someone anonymously, it will not be received by the church in the first century, because it's coming in as an anonymous text, because it doesn't have that sense of authority behind it. So yes, the text doesn't clearly say who the author is, but I think most of us can, I don't know if rest assured is the right term, but we can be a little more confident because the original audience definitely knew who the author was. Papias comes along and says the original audience says it's Matthew. Modern scholars take that with a grain of salt and say we don't really know that that's what the earliest church, the earliest audience, would have thought when they received it. We just don't know. So when we're looking at the text, we look at differences in the text and the ways that things are described. And one of the things that sticks out is that in Matthew, Jesus calls a tax collector to follow him, and that tax collector's name in the Gospel of Matthew is Matthew, right? And so scholars look at this and say, oh, well, that's why Papias picked that name to attach it to that person, because in Matthew he's called Matthew. In Mark, his name is Levi. It's not really clear why. It's not clear why somebody would be named Levi in one text and Matthew in another text. Nobody is suggesting that they're two different guys, two different tax collectors that Jesus calls. But it's uncommon for people to have two completely different names in the first century, right? Paul is also known as Saul, but that's kind of the same name, right? It kind of means the same thing. Trying to think of another example, but I can't think of one off the top of my head. It seems odd for someone to be named Levi and also Matthew. It just doesn't make a lot of sense. And so scholars have to deal with that. We have to deal with that. We have to contend with that. We think that it would make sense if the author of this text were a tax collector. He would have been trained in good Greek, good scribal techniques, note-taking, right? So if, hypothetically, and if you've seen The Chosen, you're probably used to this. if Matthew were a tax collector and one of the 12 disciples, and then wrote this text, he might have been following Jesus around taking notes. And a tax collector, maybe that's something that he would do. My main point here is that yes, we believe in the inerrancy of Scripture. Yes, we believe that Scripture is infallible and everything is accurate. Because the text is anonymous, you don't have to automatically think it's like heretical or blasphemous to say, I don't know who wrote the text. I don't know that it's really Matthew. I don't know. That's not necessarily, oh, they're a flaming, liberal, progressive, whatever. They don't believe in the Bible because they're questioning this. Not necessarily. Because the text is anonymous. Now, if somebody is coming along and saying, I don't think Paul wrote Romans, then you kind of have to wrestle through ideas of inerrancy and infallibility and all these things, because the text says that Paul wrote Romans. Nothing in the Gospel of Matthew says that Matthew wrote it. And so we just kind of have to deal with that as a historical question. I don't know if we've talked about this a lot when we were going through Mark, but one of the things that we need to be careful of is we've got the gospel up here. And in this method that we're talking about, we kind of use the evidence from the gospel. So we'll put a big E here for evidence. We use the evidence to come up with the background, right? So we'll look at the text. I'm using my mouse, and so that's why the handwriting looks, like a 2-year-old. We use the text, the gospel, the evidence in it to come up with a background. This is the author and the date and the area and the region and whatever. But then we also turn around and use that to interpret the text. Oh, because Matthew's a tax collector, therefore we're going to interpret the text this way. Or because Matthew is interested in this purpose, this idea, we're going to interpret the text this way. This is very clearly circular reasoning. And you just have to be careful with that. Sometimes it can be a spiral where you're circling down and getting closer to the truth, and maybe that's helpful. But sometimes you're just creating a background in order to interpret difficulties in the text. And it's not very helpful. It's not the best way to do it. So what most scholars will do now is just say, you know what? The text is what it is. It's come down to us in its present form, and we have to deal with it as a literary device. We have to read it like a book, like every other book, using our English literature techniques and skills to read and interpret the text. And then anything beyond that is going to be faith-based and not academic. So you can come through and say, I think the text is arguing this, and then we as Christians come along and say, okay, and we agree with the text, and this is how we apply it to our lives, and this is why we think this and this. But sometimes because of these difficulties, the anonymity of the text and the unclear source and background and all this sort of stuff, sometimes we just have to deal with the text as it's actually given to us. Good on this? So in addition to talking about Matthew as the author, we also need to talk about the dating. Obviously, because this class is taking as an assumption that Matthew is using Mark, the dating of Matthew depends on the dating of Mark. I looked at some of your synopses. I think some of you are probably a little too early for Mark. I think somebody was saying, Mark was written in 40. And I don't know that that's a genuine, I don't know that scholars are making that argument. I think most folks are saying, Mark is written after everything that Paul has written, after Paul's death, which is 58 AD? I think I could be wrong on that. And most scholars will argue it's sometime around the fall of Jerusalem. So maybe Mark is written in 65, maybe it's written in 75, I don't know. Maybe some really conservative scholars who are really interested in pushing the date up would try to argue that Mark is written in 55. I don't know. Most of the real, SBL scholars, the academics who are publishing on Matthew or on Mark, are going to put Mark in the 60s or 70s. 65 to 75, somewhere like that. That means that Matthew has to be after Mark. If you think of Mark as maybe it's written in 60, cool. How long do you think it takes for Mark to be written down and spread to the point where Matthew has access to it as a text and the time to sit and make his own version of a gospel? 10 years, give or take, for the text to spread far enough and be copied enough times that Matthew can have access to it? I don't know. So most scholars will look at things like that, the historical stuff, as well as the stuff that's inside Matthew. Matthew pretty clearly talks about the fall of Jerusalem. And I think we talked about this with Mark. There's a debate about whether it is prophecy or just detailing something that's already happened, right? There's a big difference in predicting 9/11 5 years before it happens or describing it 5 years after it happened. And most of scholars that I know of will say that Matthew is written after 70, after the fall of Jerusalem. I don't know of people who are pushing Matthew earlier than 70. I'm sure that there are some, but I haven't read a monograph or a commentary on Matthew recently that puts Matthew before 70. I'm not familiar with anything. They also use terminology in Matthew where Jesus is talking about the Jews and talking about their synagogue, like this is us over here and this is them in their synagogue over here. And that might indicate, scholars will argue, that indicates some sort of separation between Christianity and Judaism, which, if you're familiar and if you've had classes with me before, you might know. I mean, that doesn't happen early, right? Paul is born a Jew and lives a Jew and dies a Jew. He's not excommunicated. He's not kicked out. He doesn't consider himself anything other than Jewish. All of Jesus's disciples are this way. The 12 are all Jews when they die. Even though they consider themselves fulfilled Jews, following the Messiah, for them it is never, we're starting our own thing called Christianity. It happens later. And so scholars will look at this and say, this is a later development. That must mean that Matthew is written later. Maybe Matthew's written in 90. And maybe there's starting to be some sort of separation between the Jews and the Christians. It's kind of speculative. We really don't have much information on the ground in the first century outside of the New Testament to talk about the separation between Jews and Christians. A lot of scholars say it definitely doesn't happen until 70, and it probably didn't actually happen until after the Bar Kokhba revolt, which is 135. I don't know if we've talked about this. There's another Jewish revolt against Rome in 135. It doesn't go well. And at this point, you could see, like, if you're a Christian, it would probably be beneficial to you to distance yourself from the Jews if they continue to get smacked down by Rome. Right? If you say, oh no, I'm actually not a Jew, I'm a Christian, I do something different, that might help you at this point. Whereas in the first century, in 60 AD, no, Rome doesn't like new religious movements. So you're going to say you're Jewish to protect yourself. Because if you're forming a new cult, that's a threat to Rome. Judaism isn't a threat to Rome. They've been around forever. They properly venerate their ancestors and they're, an acceptable form of religion. A new religion, no, that's going to get crushed. After 135, that protection might not really last anymore. So I think I've got a slide here. Yeah. So I think Matthew's probably between 70 and 80, somewhere around there, give or take. I think 80 is probably an easy roundabout answer for Matthew's actual date. The next thing for us to talk about is the audience in Matthew. And this is the same sort of conjecture, the same sort of guessing, and it has the same sort of issues of creating an audience and then interpreting the text based on that audience can be circular. So let's look at the text and see what it talks about. And let's look at what church history tells us, right? Papias, I mentioned that he said something about Matthew being written in the Hebrew language. Nobody now thinks that Matthew is a translation of something from a different language. It's written in Greek and it appears as a Greek original. Maybe in the earliest church they thought it was originally written in Hebrew or Aramaic, but that did not really stick. So maybe Papias meant that it was written in the Hebrew style or was interested in Hebrew things, which is certainly true. The gospel is highly interested in Jewish law and customs. It is frequently referring to Old Testament texts, right? To say such and such happened and it was in fulfillment of such and such a text. And for the longest time, Christians and theologians have looked at that and said, oh, the text is intended for a Jewish audience. It's Jewish Christians who would want to see that Jesus is the fulfillment of these things from the Old Testament. That's what they're interested in, and that's what the text is for. There is some pushback on that now, where scholars will look at the way that these things function and say, I don't know that this is designed for a Jewish audience. For example, in Matthew's eagerness to cite fulfillment texts, hey, this happened in fulfillment of this, he quotes something and says, Jesus settled down in Nazareth to fulfill what was written, that he shall be called a Nazarene. That text doesn't exist, at least as far as we know. And it's not in the Old Testament. The idea that the Messiah would be a Nazarene. We don't know where Matthew gets that from. And a properly steeped in Old Testament Jewish audience, that might be a red flag for them to say, hey, you said it was in fulfillment, but we don't know that text. We don't know what you're talking about. He also changes kind of the commonly accepted meaning of a passage to make it apply to Jesus. The good example of this is, Joseph takes the family down to Egypt to fulfill what was written in Hosea that says, out of Egypt I will call my son. Now, in the text, in the Old Testament, it's clearly referring to Israel coming out of Egypt in the Exodus. I mean, that's the clear meaning of the text. No one is reading that and thinking that is something to do with the Messiah, the way that you might if you're reading the suffering servant or something in Daniel or whatever. No one is reading that and thinking, oh, this is about the Messiah. No, it's about Israel. It's about God calling Israel out of Egypt and rescuing them. And Matthew is taking that text and imbuing it with more meaning than the original audience would have thought, or a Jewish audience would have thought. And some scholars now look at that and say, a first century Jew might not be on board with that. They might not appreciate him adding meaning to these texts. We don't know. But they look at those things and say, maybe Matthew is written for a Gentile audience who wants it to be connected to Judaism. And so Matthew has a little more liberty to say, well, this is the way that it's connected to this ancient religion. It gives it some credence. It gives it some roots. But he can also have flexibility with the way that he's interpreting the text, which contemporary Jews might not be on board with. So maybe it's written for people who don't know that much about Judaism, but who are interested in it. Again, we simply don't know. It's just one of those things that we kind of have to read the text and try to see, who would this be appealing to? I know when we were reading through Mark, we saw Aramaic texts that are translated, right? He puts something in Aramaic and then translates it, which implies that his audience that he intends doesn't know what the translation would mean otherwise. Or he explains Jewish, cleansing rituals, which implies that his audience might not be aware of those things. So when you're reading through Matthew, look for those same sort of tells to see, does the way this story is presented, or the way that Matthew is talking to me, tell you something about what he thinks I'm supposed to get out of this? Now, let's talk a minute about the purpose. The way that I would describe, if I had to describe Mark in, really, really brief terms, I would say something like, Mark, the summary of Mark would be, Jesus is the Son of God crucified for you. Or Jesus is the Son of God crucified, or something like that, right? It's very short and very much focused on the crucifixion. For Matthew, I would probably say, Jesus is what we've been waiting for. This is it. And Matthew, a lot of his purpose is to point back to things that have happened in the past and show that what's going on now with Jesus is the fulfillment of the plan. It's the fulfillment of the promises. It's the fulfillment of all the prophecies from the Old Testament, that Jesus is God with us, and that Jesus is a new and greater Moses, a new and greater David, a new and greater Torah. All of these things taken together show what's happening in Jesus is all part of this great plan that we've all been expecting. We've all been waiting for it. And Matthew really nails that. I think. I was thinking about this when I came up with the little summaries for Mark and Matthew. I think Luke is probably more interested in something along the lines of Jesus brings power to the powerless, something along those lines. And John is very much Jesus is God overall, right? Throughout John, Jesus is in control, and nothing else really comes close to bothering him, to getting to him. The way that Mark, like, stuff is happening to Jesus. And John, Jesus is way up here above it all. We'll get to John. I just like talking about it. Good on this? Any questions on any of this so far? Okay, so let's look at an outline for Matthew to kind of break down in broad strokes. Again, this is all created by modern scholars. You can disagree with this and still be, a good believer. The beginning and end are kind of stretched out in this way: the birth and preparation for the ministry, and then the end and resurrection. And then a lot of scholars like to look at Matthew and break it down into these 5 main sections called discourses. They say that each of these sections has a large teaching unit as well as a large miracle unit. So he does some teachings and he does some miracles in this unit. And I think each one ends with something along the lines of after having said these things, or something like that, to kind of bracket them off. They use this, and scholars will look at this and say maybe Matthew is trying to imply that his text is a new Torah, right? That in the same way that Torah is 5 books, maybe 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, Matthew has designed his book to be 5 sections, just like Torah. I'm not necessarily convinced by that argument, just because I'm not convinced that a first century audience who's hearing the gospel for the first time, or even the second or the third time, would pick up on something like that. Oh, he just said, after having said all these things, and he said that 3 chapters ago, so maybe this is a new section that we're moving into, and oh, this is now the 3rd section, maybe this is supposed to be Torah. Oh, he said it 5 times, maybe this is supposed to be 5 sections for Torah. I don't know that a first century audience is supposed to pick up on that. I just don't really buy it. Maybe it's a helpful way for us to categorize it. Maybe Matthew did intend for it to be written that way, but I don't know that Matthew intends his audience to pick up on it, right? Scholars will do this. They'll write clever little things in their stuff that they don't really expect the audience to pick up on. My supervising professor, he preaches at his church pretty regularly, and he sneaks Taylor Swift lyrics into his sermons. I think every single sermon. I know that he does that for obvious reasons, but I don't know that he expects his audience to pick up on that. If you're in the inn, if you know that that's what he's doing, then yeah, maybe you pick up on it. But if you don't know that's what he's doing, you don't miss anything by missing that. Maybe that's what's happening here. Maybe Matthew intends for it to be this way, and then he's telling people this is what I did, and maybe they'll pick up on it that way because he's telling them that. But he doesn't expect people to get it on their own. I don't know. For us, it might just be a clever, helpful way for us to break down, oh, this is a new section of the teaching that we're moving into with Jesus. Jesus also has a lot more teaching in Matthew than he does in Mark. There's just a lot more teaching instances, a lot more of just Jesus talking, a lot more of Jesus monologuing, right? The Sermon on the Mount is 3 chapters of just Jesus talking. If you've got a red letter Bible, it's all read for 3 chapters. Mark doesn't really give you that. And maybe there's a reason to it. Maybe him doing that is purposeful. Any questions on any of this? Oh, here's your explanation of what each of these things are. The instructions, the parables, the discourse, those are what the actual main teaching moments are in each of these bigger sections. Good? Before I got saved, I tried to read my Bible. I really did. And people would say you should read your Bible, and I have it on my nightstand, and in an effort to keep it from collecting dust, I would pick it up and try to read it. And I would always start at the beginning, because that's where you start with books. And I would read Genesis, and it had a couple good chapters. And then it was a genealogy, Genesis 10. And it was so boring, and I never got through it. I just couldn't. When I got to college, I said that to somebody. I told them, yeah, I've tried reading my Bible before, but it didn't make any sense, and there's these genealogies, and I don't like it because Genesis. And they said, oh, no. You should read Matthew. You start in the New Testament. Read Matthew. It'll be great. And so I open up to Matthew. I have to find it, figure out where it is. And Matthew starts with a genealogy. And I remember thinking, this isn't any better. This is exactly the same thing, what I just said I didn't like. And now it's another genealogy. I don't get it. Genealogies are pretty common, right? I mean, if you've read through the Bible, you know. And Matthew's genealogy is a very typical ancient genealogy. Now, there's a couple things with this. Ancient genealogies do not have to include every individual person. They can skip people who don't matter, according to them. They can include names that might not have otherwise been included, the wives of people when they went to include them. But sometimes they'll skip a generation. So pretend like my father is a very important, high-ranking person, very influential, and my son is also a very important, high-ranking person in the grand scheme of our nation's history or whatever. But I'm kind of a nobody, bum, didn't really do anything. In a genealogy like that, when my father is at the age when he has me, the genealogy might say that when he was such and such an age, he begat or he had my son, and they would name my son because at that age my father started the line which leads to my son, right? And they would skip over me because I don't matter. Now, why would people do this? One, to cut out people who don't matter, or particularly bad people. Matthew does this. Matthew cuts out names. We know that he does because we have the Old Testament. It seems like Matthew does this to try to get to 14. In the genealogy that Matthew gives you, he starts with Abraham, and then there's 14 generations to David, and then there's 14 generations to Babylon, and then there's 14 generations to Jesus. But like the Abraham to David, we know that there are more than 14 generations. We have the names. And so Matthew cuts out people, which is, again, pretty normal, but he wants 14 to be the number. We don't really know why. There's a couple explanations, and all of them are as good a guess as anybody. In Hebrew, I think you all probably know the names are all numbers, right? They don't have a separate numerical system like we have A, B, C, and 1, 2, 3. For them, A is 1, and B is 2, and C is 3. And the other thing is there are no vowels in the earliest languages. So the name David would just be D-V-D. And in the language, in the numerical system, this is 4 and 6 and 4. And so when you add them up, it's 14. So maybe that's what Matthew is trying to get to, is it's David, David, David. 3 is a pretty clearly good biblical number, right? That there's 3 sets of 14. And also 14, maybe the number of perfection is 7. And so maybe it's doubly perfect. That is perfect twice. I don't know. All of these are as good a guess as anybody. And we just have no real way of knowing what Matthew is trying to achieve. He is clearly trying to achieve something, though, in the genealogy. There's another aspect of the genealogy that he gives that's odd. He includes women. I think there's 4 of them that are named. And there's a lot of debate about why. Maybe it's just that Matthew finds value in including women. Maybe. I think it's more than that, though. There's 2 main options. One of them is they're all foreign women, right? Bathsheba is married to a Hittite, and Ruth comes from a distant land, right? Etc. And maybe Matthew, even in the genealogy, is setting up for, Jesus has non-Jews in his genealogy. The gospel is going to be for Gentiles also. So setting us up for the Great Commission in Matthew 28 to send the gospel to everybody. Maybe. I think the second option is more likely, and it's this. All of the women named have some sort of improper sexual story as part of their background, right? So in the genealogy, it says, David had Solomon by the wife of Uriah. Well, there's a story there, right? David committed adultery and took Bathsheba and murdered Uriah. Ruth has this odd story where she's married and then her husband dies and then she does something to get Boaz's attention and uncovers his feet and sleeps at the floor, and odd. Tamar and Rahab are both also have these odd sexual stories. Maybe, I think, Matthew is preparing you, the audience, for some sort of questionable sexual background for Jesus's birth, right? Mary is going to be very soon described as a virgin who became pregnant. Yeah, right. Like that happens. We all know what really happened, right? Maybe Matthew is setting that up to say, you recall the stories that we all remember from the Old Testament, where there are women who are good, honest women who have some sort of oddities in their sexual background, and they are all part of this story. And the same thing is happening with Mary, where maybe you don't believe her, maybe you think something odd is going on here too with regards to like her sexuality, but this is all part of the plan. It's just the same thing again that happened with Ruth and Bathsheba and Tamar and the others. Maybe I like that idea better than the others. What do you all think? Do you have any questions on this? Good. So, yeah, the genealogy is just a who's who. It is just trying to get you from those Old Testament stories to Jesus and to connect him to what's going on. Now, when we get to Luke, we'll look at Luke's genealogy and we'll compare and contrast to see something's a little different here, what's going on there. And I'm sure your textbook has some information about that as well. We don't need to talk about it now because right now we're just reading Matthew, and it doesn't really matter that Matthew's is different. Matthew's is the first one that we've gotten, so we just take it, right? Mark doesn't give us this genealogy. Matthew is interested in telling us not just about Jesus' ministry, but where Jesus comes from. What is he actually doing, right? One more thing here. We talked a little bit about the prophecy. Trace this. Think about this while you're reading it. It's very important to Matthew that the things that are happening are all according to plan, right? That everything is going well, and that God has promised and prepared us for this moment, for Jesus coming. Matthew is very interested in that. And this is something you need to keep track of while you are going through and reading the text for yourself. Not just, oh, cool, this is referencing this, but like, why is it that Matthew takes the time to tell you that it's referencing this? What's the authority behind what Matthew is drawing upon, right? There's some authority, even when he says like, this was to fulfill what was written, he shall become a Nazarene. Even though we don't have that text, there's still some authority that Matthew is claiming there by referring to it. Does that make sense? And this is important for Matthew, to pick up on these prophecies to show that Jesus is fulfilling them. It's also important for him to pick up on Jesus not just fulfilling prophecies, but being the fulfillment of maybe archetypes that you saw in the Old Testament. The great example that I have of this is Moses. Jesus is presented in Matthew, at least in Matthew 1 through 7, as a new and better Moses, right? So if you think of the birth narrative, there's a king who's out to get him, and so he has to hide from the king. There's like a mistaken identity, and he has to hide out from the king because the king is trying to kill him. The same way that Pharaoh kills all the babies in Egypt, Herod is killing all of the babies in Bethlehem because he missed Jesus. Where is it that he hides out? Well, he hides out in Egypt, right? In the same way that Joseph goes down into Egypt under a false identity, we have the same telling again, where the Magi show up, but they lie about where they're going, or they don't actually return to Herod, and they go off on their own place. What is it that sends Joseph, Jesus' father, to Egypt? Well, he has a prophetic dream, right? And in a dream, he's warned not to return and to go and hide in Egypt. How is it that the Israelites get to Egypt? It's because Joseph dreams prophetic dreams that warn him and send him to Egypt, right? He has these prophetic dreams, and it gets him in trouble with his brothers, and he ends up in Egypt. So you have the same thing. Joseph's who are dreaming dreams, and it lands them in Egypt, okay? Now, Moses comes and rescues the Israelites from Egypt, and eventually Jesus comes also out of Egypt. And we get the same text. The text from Hosea that references Israel coming out of Egypt is used to reference Jesus coming out of Egypt. Now, where does Jesus go immediately after coming out of Egypt? In the story, the next thing that happens is he goes through water. He's baptized. And the Israelites come out of Egypt, and they also go through water in like the parting of the Red Sea. And then the Israelites, after they pass through, they're tempted in the wilderness for 40 years. Jesus also is tempted in the wilderness, and he has the same kind of experiences. Temptations with food, and temptations with power, and temptations with authority. After that, Moses goes up Mount Sinai. He goes up the mountain, and he receives a law from God to give to the people. And in Matthew 5, Jesus, coming out of his temptation, ascends a mountain and gives a law, the Sermon on the Mount. And even in the Sermon on the Mount, he has these things that we call, you'll normally see them called antitheses. They're not really antithetical, though. They're not really opposites. Jesus will say, you have heard it said, don't murder. But I say to you, don't hate. You've heard it said, don't commit adultery. But I say to you, don't lust. It's not like the antithesis would be, you've heard it said, don't murder. But I say, commit genocide. And that's not what Jesus does at all. He doesn't remove the obligation to the law. He makes it harder, right? You shouldn't kill people because that'll really mess with our social constructs. But Jesus is coming along and saying, no. Hating people will mess with society too. That will destroy your community. You shouldn't do that either. Jesus does not abandon the law. He elevates it. He gets to the heart issue. And that's what I think we're all going to see when we get to the Sermon on the Mount. That Jesus is raising it to a heart issue and then setting the bar so high that it becomes an impossible standard. He says, you should outdo the Pharisees in obeying the Torah, which the Pharisees are like the cream of the crop. They're the best ones at obeying Torah. And then he says, you should be perfect in the same way that God is perfect. Whoa. I'm not going to be able to do that, right? It seems like Jesus is coming on the scene and teaching in this way to make people come to him, right? To say, hey, Jesus, I'm not perfect. And, I've been doing a really good job not murdering people, but I sure hate some people. Have you met my neighbor? He's awful. And then when they come to Jesus, that's when Jesus can actually have impact and meet with them and teach them and talk to them to say, this is how you can actually fulfill the Torah. This is how you can actually fulfill the law. I'm not going to abandon the law. I'm not going to replace the law. I'm going to show you how you can really do it, because apart from me, you can't. I think we miss this a lot of the time, where we say Jesus came and got rid of all those laws, and now we don't have to obey them anymore. In Matthew, that is not the case. Jesus does not come to throw them out. He comes to give you the ability in yourself to follow them.